Pushkin. Previously on Deep Cover.
Now, in a criminal case, the prosecution side of the story, they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. As to the defense side of the story, we just have to create reasonable doubt. But we did way more than that.
I felt like I had to go to trial every day, and I feel like I had to find the truth for not only for the family, but for my mom.
People don't understand it. It's not TV that it's cut and everybody's happy. There is a life after a case, and people have to live the rest of their lives dealing with the murderer, his family, his friends, his associates. They're going to have to look behind their back for the rest of their lives.
In May of 2008, the trial for the murder of Aron Wood was in full swing. And Tyrone Wood, Aron's youngest brother, he had a front row seat for it all, including a view of the defendant, Tom Guybeson.
I had to see this guy, and then, I'm thinking, I know you did it, and you wanted to meet your maker one day. And that's beyond me then after that. Because I know you killed my brother. So.
At least Tyrone didn't have to face this alone.
I always had someone with me, whether it was my brother, my uncle, one of my uncle's friends. I was never ever completely by myself.
For years, the story of Aron Wood and his mysterious murder had been a largely private affair for the Wood family. The grief, the uncertainty, and the hope for justice had been theirs alone. But that had changed. Newspapers printed blow-by-blow coverage of the trial for weeks. It was a gripping drama playing out in real time. So many people were following the story now. One of them was Tyrone's boss. Usually, he was a man of few words, not the expressive type. But apparently, he felt compelled to say something.
He said, "Wow." I said, "Wow. What you say wow for?" And him and I are not close. And he said, "I couldn't believe that you went through that." Because he saw it and he was watching the news. And he was blown away because he never knew. And I tell people all the time, everybody got a story. I don't want nobody to have my story of a sibling being killed, but everybody has a story.
For the Wood family, this ordeal, which had shaped their lives for almost 2 decades, was maybe, just maybe, coming to a close. Both sides made their closing arguments. Then, at last, it was time for the jury to deliberate. It would be up to them to pass judgment and render a verdict. Turns out, things got pretty heated in that jury room. The whole process was fraught. But in the end, they did reach a verdict. It just wasn't the verdict that anyone, either the defense or the prosecution, ever expected. I'm Jake Halpern, and this is Deep Cover Season 4, The Nameless Man. Episode 6, The Verdict, our season finale. There's almost nothing in the public record about what the jurors discussed during their deliberations. Some of them took notes, but they had to hand them over at the end of the trial. One juror talked to a newspaper reporter when it was all over, but that was it. So their whole decision-making process, it's remained a mystery to this day. I knew it'd be tricky tracking down the jurors in this case. Well, for starters, I wasn't even sure how many of them were still alive. I mean, it had been over 15 years since the trial. But eventually, I connected with several of the jurors and interviewed 2 of them, starting with this guy.
Okay. My name is Bob. I'm a Philadelphian, and I was selected to serve on the jury that heard the case of Thomas Guybeson.
To protect his privacy, I'm not going to use Bob's last name. But I can tell you, Bob is a science nerd, and that informs his outlook on life.
Being trained as a scientist, I would say, yeah, logic was a big part of it, or at least seriously questioning things, and what's proof and what's not proof. Where is there doubt? What degree of doubt is there in things?
So in many ways, Bob is kind of an ideal juror. He's been selected to sit on 6 juries. For this trial, Mike Farrell, the defense lawyer, questioned potential jurors about their sense of fairness. He asked Bob point blank if he could set aside whatever biases he might have about someone being a skinhead.
And my response was, I wouldn't make any presumption on that. I would listen to the testimony, and I would decide according to this specific facts of the specific case.
Bob was selected to be on the jury in this case, along with 11 others. 4 of them were black, 8 of them were white. Tom Guybeson was facing 4 charges: a weapon charge, conspiracy to commit murder, murder in the first degree, and finally, ethnic intimidation. That last one is basically what Pennsylvania calls a hate crime. As I see it, there were 2 fundamental questions that the jury was facing. Number 1, did it really happen? In other words, do you believe that years ago, Tom Guybeson murdered a black man in Philadelphia? Then there was the second question. Was there enough evidence to convict Tom specifically for the murder of Aaron Wood? The first question, did it really happen, hinged on the testimony of the prosecution's 3 star witnesses. There were the 2 ex-girlfriends, both of whom claimed that Tom had confessed to them. And then there was Craig Peterson, who said that he was the accomplice. Bob listened to the witnesses' testimonies with rapt attention. He found the ex-girlfriends believable.
I don't remember anything specifically about their testimony that I thought that doesn't ring true, or I really have doubts about that. I thought they made credible witnesses.
And he felt the same way about Craig. Thought he seemed credible. But here's the thing, says Bob.
Somebody can be credible about something that happened 20 years ago and not remember it completely correctly.
Bob said, case in point was the very conversation that he and I were having.
Now, I'm trying to remember 15 years ago what I experienced on a trial. I can't remember a lot of it.
Bob told me some things he remembered very well, specific moments in the trial, feelings he had, parts of conversations that took place. But other details escaped him, or maybe he recalled them hazily, not in a way that he could trust. And this right here was the problem for Bob. He told me it was entirely possible that Craig was telling the truth, but that Craig's memory was imperfect. And that's a big thing, because Craig's confession, with all of its specific details, is what connected Tom Guybeson to the murder of Aaron Wood.
I definitely did have some doubts. Yeah, absolutely. But I wanted to discuss them. I wanted to hear what other people had to say because they might alleviate my doubts.
So when the jury gathered behind closed doors, Bob expressed his doubts. He just laid them all out.
They might have even killed someone, but it might not have been on that day and at that time, because there were possible recollection issues, and that I thought that the location description, the date and time that they came to the city were wobbly, and the description of how they got where they got.
When you start voicing your doubts to your fellow jurors, what do they say back?
Various jurors, are quiet. Some of them just take it in. A couple of other people started to say the same thing. Is this timeline, something we can rely on, and the location, something we can rely on? Do we really know that that's where they wound up and that they killed, Aaron Wood? I don't know.
Back in 2006, when the Philly PD first started searching for a potential victim, they looked at all the unsolved murders from January through May of 1989. There were 37 of them. Then they narrowed down the pool of possibilities by considering several key details that Craig remembered. These details included the general location of the crime, the type of weapon, and the nature of the wound, a single shot to the head. They found just one match, a raw wood. But this is the thing about reasonable doubt. All it takes is a juror questioning a single fact. Like, for example, what if Tom fired his gun twice, not once? Because there was in fact another cold case victim from the spring of '89 who died of 2 gunshot wounds. The defense brought this other victim up during the trial. So, if you find Craig credible, like so many of the jurors did, it seems very reasonable to assume that he'd correctly remember how many times Tom's gun went off. Craig had been consistent about this. But the key is, you've got to have faith in Craig's memory. Enough faith that reasonable doubt doesn't creep in. Bob says as he continued to think it through, he became increasingly convinced that, at the very least, Tom and Craig had conspired to commit murder. He was just having his doubts about the particulars of whom they might have killed. And so too were some of his fellow jurors, says Bob. So they decided to send a note to the judge with a question. They actually did this a few times. And here's what Bob was really struggling with.
If we convict somebody of murder, do we have to convict them of murdering a specific person? Now that sounds like a weird question to ask, right? But that's where we got to in the discussions. Like, we even believe they came here to kill somebody and they might have killed somebody. We're just not convinced that's who they killed if they did kill somebody.
And what did the judge say?
The judge essentially, stated the law is the law, but the bottom line was, if you convict someone of a murder, it must be a specific person that they killed that you have to convict them of.
Let me ask you a question. If the judge had come back and told you you can make a murder conviction even if you don't think it was Wood.
Yes.
How would you?
Would I have voted?
Yeah.
I believe I would have voted guilty on that.
By the third day of deliberations, the mood in the jury room was tense.
I was tired. I was thinking about this all the time, even when I wasn't in there. It's difficult to be put in this situation, to know there was a victim. Even the idea that, the family, might be looking for closure on this and want somebody that's, guilty of it. But I haven't been given the evidence to be able to do that.
Bob says from the start of the trial, he was determined to hear all the evidence, all the testimony, and keep an open mind, to focus on the facts, to avoid making leaps of logic, and when necessary, to question his own thinking. And now his doubts took hold.
I teared up when I was talking to the other jurors. I was, we were kind of wrung out.
He kept asking himself,
am I seeing it the right way? Is there something I'm missing? Is it a moral failing of mine that I'm not willing to make the jump because I think it's shaky? Or am I on the right moral side of the question because I actually have doubts and a series of doubts and I can't make the leap? Does that make me weak? I don't know. All I can do is be true to myself. I'm getting emotional now.
Well, all these years later, it's still...
Yeah, it was really hard.
As deliberations wore on, it seemed like the jury was starting to unravel. If there was any hope of a resolution, it fell upon this person.
I'd like to think of myself as even-keeled, and I think that's probably why I took a lead role on the jury.
This is the jury's foreman. I'm not using his real name. We decided to call him Nick in our interview. As foreman, Nick was the guy who had to read the verdict. But the foreman, he's also like a team manager. And at this point, 3 days in, it seemed like the team had hit a brick wall.
Pressure was growing within the group to come to a conclusion. There was a feeling of we don't have more to go on.
At this point, they'd been over the testimony again and again. They'd asked for guidance from the judge, and now they had to start making choices. Based on my conversations with the jurors and news coverage from the time, it seems like the jury divided into 3 camps. First, there was the guilty camp. They were convinced by the prosecution's argument, and were basically ready to convict Tom Gibson on all counts, including the murder of Ron Wood. According to Nick, the foreman, this camp included the majority of jurors, including himself. Then there was what I call the on-the-fence camp, which included Bob. They thought there'd probably been a murder, but had doubts that the victim was a Ron Wood. And finally, there was the holdout. He was a camp unto himself, one guy, and apparently he wanted to acquit Tom Gibson on all counts. He made this plain from the very start, and after making his case, he refused to discuss the matter any further, just stopped talking. And now, 3 days into deliberations, patience was wearing thin.
There was a sense Tuesday morning that we were out of time, essentially. There was no more persuasion to happen. We'd all, made our cases based on notes, based on recollection, based on feelings, and the holdout was not budging.
How do you navigate out of that situation?
So we negotiated.
Just to be clear here, when he says they negotiated, he's talking about the charges brought against Tom. Like, could they reach a compromise? As the foreman of the jury, Nick was in a tricky spot because he thought what the prosecution argued was in fact true. He found Craig believable. He found Craig's detailed memories credible. But as foreman, he was also trying to build consensus and avoid a hung jury.
It's a tough situation, right? Because if you come back with a hung jury, there's a chance that this guy ends up serving no time at all if the case is not retried.
Yeah. That's exactly what the conversation was. And I think enough people felt strongly that he should go to prison for some of this.
Ultimately, after 3 days of deliberations, the jury sent word. They were done. All that was left to do was file back into the courtroom and tell everyone what they'd decided. That's after the break. Mike Farrell, the defense lawyer, remembers getting the call that the jury had reached a verdict.
In the life of a trial lawyer, there is no time that in any way comes close to the apprehension when you know the jury has a verdict, but you haven't heard it yet.
With growing anticipation, he made his way back to the courtroom.
I remember distinctly having to get on an elevator and ride up an elevator, multiple floors.
In the courtroom, everyone was there. The prosecutor, Roger King, members of Ron Wood's family, the jury, the press, and of course, Tom Gibson. The judge called the room to attention. Nick, the foreman of the jury, rose to his feet and prepared to read the verdict.
It was incredibly surreal. Standing in a room with someone who's being accused of, cold-blooded murder, believing that he did it, being convinced, I should say, that he was the one who did these things. And knowing that he's going to look me directly in the eye, it was just incredibly surreal. And I just took a breath and reminded myself this was real life, and then read the results.
The charges were read aloud one final time before the jury delivered their verdict.
The court officer then reads the charge. To the first charge, the murder of Aaron Wood, how do you find the defendant? And the jury says, not guilty. And that not is a glorious moment in the life of a trial lawyer.
What goes through your mind at that moment when you hear that?
Justice has been done.
The jury acquitted him of first-degree murder and of ethnic intimidation, too. But there was more to the verdict. The jury did find Tom Guybeson guilty on the two lesser charges: conspiracy to commit murder and carrying a firearm without a license, crimes that could land Tom in prison for years. That was the compromise, the deal the jury had struck. When this hit the papers, the Philadelphia Daily News called it a bizarre split verdict. The reporter described the scene in the courtroom after the verdict was announced. Quote, "A tense Guybeson appeared angry, his hands tightly clenched on the desk. His attorney, Mike Farrell, acknowledged the partial win by playfully poking Guybeson in the bicep, above the Hitler and swastika tattoo hidden by his white long-sleeve shirt." For the members of the Wood family, several of whom were present, the verdict made no sense.
We were in the courtroom. The first word, I guess, comes to mind is what my uncle said, because I was basically speechless. He said travesty.
That's Tyrone Wood, Iran's youngest brother. Much like Nick, the foreman of the jury, Tyrone believed Craig's testimony, believed in the integrity of his memory, and felt that there should have been a murder conviction.
Murder is murder. The guy that drove him testified that he done it. He did it. I drove him there. He shot the black man.
At some point, according to a press account, Roger King, the prosecutor, gathered members of the Wood family into a side room and told them, "Don't try to make any sense out of it." Now there's an impossible task. It had been almost 20 years since Iran Wood had died. And during this time, this is what the Wood family had tried to do: make sense out of it, understand how and why Iran had died, and hope for closure. Roger King told the family that the verdict was likely a compromise within the jury, which of course was true. Nick, the foreman, had tried to build consensus.
I thought it was the best we could do. And that did not feel great. There was no way to feel 100% about it when you're negotiating on something you believe to be true.
Does that mean that you feel that basically, like, he got away with murder in the sense that he got off on a murder charge that you felt he deserved to be convicted of?
That's correct.
Long after I talked with Nick, his words lingered in my mind. You're negotiating on something that you believe to be true. But how do you barter with the truth? Because at the end of the day, the truth is supposed to be singular, non-negotiable. But it seemed like in this case, perhaps the truth and justice, or at least the justice that was possible, were two separate things. And so a deal was struck, a compromise. But the cost for Nick and the other members of the jury, too, was a claim to the truth as they saw it. This moment had been years in the making. The whole investigation began back in 2004 when two federal agents, Scott Duffy and Terry Mortimer, set out to solve this case. For them, this was a divine quest to find a nameless man, the victim, and they believed they'd found him. For the Wood family, this was a quest for another nameless man, the murderer, and they believed they'd found him. But in the end, some on the jury didn't see it that way, and this left everyone wondering, what did it all mean? For those involved, the agents, the jurors, and especially the Wood family, the question lingered, and they each, in their own way, searched for an answer. Scott Duffy, the FBI agent, remained unshaken in his belief that they had solved this crime.
I felt so strongly that we had the right person and the right victim connected. But that's what happens in a case where I have to accept whatever the jury delivers. It doesn't tell me if I did enough or didn't do enough. I don't go down that rabbit hole. I can't. I can what if everything to death.
Scott says that he felt a sense of relief when it was all over, a sense of vindication, that justice was in fact served, because Tom had been found guilty on some counts, and he'd been sent to prison. I asked Scott how he felt now about Craig Peterson, and whether he thinks Craig got the justice he deserved.
I mean, he may not have pulled the trigger, but if he is to be believed, he conspired to murder an innocent man, and he walked away scot-free. How do you process that?
I process it in a way that, what's the alternative? If we did not give Craig what I think was required of us, there would be nothing. There would be no justice to the family. There would be no investigation. It would have stopped. It would have closed. And I'd be left just wondering, did we do enough?
I hear you saying that this was a kind of a necessary compromise to make this thing work. But it is a necessary compromise that sits well with you?
When it is your only option, yes. When it's your only option. It is something that has to sit, not comfortable, but it is something you must accept as part of our justice system.
Scott's partner, Terry Mortimer, told me that he felt proud of the work that he and Scott had done. But he also noted that when the verdict came out, this bizarre split verdict, as the papers called it, he got grief for it, even from his own colleagues.
I remember talking to a superior who seemed a little upset that we didn't get the full homicide conviction. And kind of like, yeah, but you only got a conspiracy, man. What happened? Like, what happened to you guys? I'm like, hey, man, we did the best we could. I mean, we weren't on the jury.
Terry says that before the verdict came down, his boss wanted to issue a press release, make a big deal out of the whole thing. But that never happened.
They seemed disappointed. It was like the case was never mentioned again. It was it was like almost like it didn't happen.
And then there's the Wood family. When I spoke with them, I could see how Iran's death had shaped their lives in so many ways. It almost pulled them under, not once, but twice. First back in 1989 when Iran was murdered, and then again in 2008 at the trial. Michael, the middle brother, told me that the trial forced him to come to terms with what he'd been grappling with for years.
Now you really facing your enemy, that this person that killed your brother. Do you really forgive this person? I've learned to forgive this person that killed my brother. I said, now that I'm facing to see who this person is, I forgave them already. There's nothing really I can do about it, you know.
In the end, both Michael and Tyrone say they found the closure they were looking for. But there were moments, still are moments, when the past resurfaces. Tom Guybeson was released from prison in 2015, which was earlier than expected. Tom was originally given 12.5 to 25 years on the conspiracy and gun charges. But it turns out the judge in the case had used the wrong sentencing guidelines, given him too much time. Tom was later resentenced and ultimately served roughly 8 years. By the way, we did reach out to Tom for this story, but we never heard back. When Tom was released, nobody informed the Wood family. They didn't get so much as a heads up from the authorities. Not a call, not a letter, nothing.
I had to find out on the internet looking for his name. And I did it on the humbug. I just punched in his name and it said, oh, he's released. I thought that they let us down. And that's why I guess, in a sense, I have some faith in the justice system, but don't let him out without letting us know.
There are other moments when memories of the trial reemerge. Tyrone told me about a trip he took to rural Pennsylvania with his then wife, and how he felt really out of place, realizing that they were the only black couple around, and kind of having a moment of anxiety.
And then I said, no, stop. You're letting this world change you. That's not who you are. And if I go and give into those fears, Thomas won. And you're not going to win. I don't care if you're out. I don't know if you're alive. I don't know what's going on with you, but I'm not going to let you win. I'm 60, so I try not to let anyone change me, because I think that's giving anybody too much power. Yeah. So I don't want to change the person I am.
As he said this, Tyrone gestured at his brother Michael and his niece Michelle.
Because they'll tell you, I'm just as silly as they come. I play around. I'm a hugger. I hug them every time I see them. And what I say? Oh, I love y'all. Because that's what my mother would always say. Love you, God bless you. And then we would leave. So
that was like the thing that I remember y'all said since, Uncle Orion passed.
Yeah.
And she always say, make sure you say, I love you.
Yeah.
Before you leave.
Yeah. So we do that now. Like I'll see my brother and I don't care who's looking. I'm going to hug my brother and tell him, I love you, man. Because we're family. Mm-hmm.
Always make sure to say it. That was Dorothy Wood's wisdom. It's a sweet sentiment. But to me, it also speaks to the way that loss and grief stay with us, whispering in our ears. When I think back to the way that everything played out with the trial, there's something fundamentally unsatisfying. Yeah, sure, we know that prosecutors bargain, passes are given, jurors strike deals. And in many ways, the whole justice system is a series of compromises. Most defendants don't even go to trial. They just make pleas. And yet, many of us, myself included, hold on to the perhaps naive hope of pure justice and clean endings, where the good guys win and righteousness prevails. And anything short of that leaves us a bit unsettled and secretly deflated. Before saying goodbye to the Wood family, I did what I always do at the end of an interview. I threw out my Hail Mary question. Anything that we didn't cover that you think is important for us to know?
I think that it's just about covered everything it's about.
I want to say that I'm grateful that my grandma's prayers was answered. I feel like that her praying put that conviction in them FBI agents to chase this cold case, and drew them in, and it's what helped bring closure to this for her.
As Michelle sees it, her grandmother sent out a prayer, and someone heard it. 2 guys, actually, Scott and Terry. And ultimately, their investigation brought her peace. Michelle never met Scott or Terry, never talked to them, never even knew their names. And yet, her take dovetails almost perfectly with theirs, the way they talked about being drawn in, almost mystically, as if summoned. I have to say, I'm not exactly sure it's the ending I'd write. But then again, this isn't my story. Not really. Deep Cover is produced by Amy Gaines McQuaid and Jacob Smith. It's edited by Karen Shakurji. Mastering by Jake Gorski. Our show art was designed by Sean Carney. Original scoring and our theme was composed by Luis Guerra. Fact-checking by Arthur Gompertz. Our story consultant was James Foreman Jr. Special thanks to Daphne Chen, Izzy Carter, Eric Sandler, Kira Posey, Jordan McMillan, Anna Skrabots, Alexandra Garriton, Lydia Jean Cott, Greta Cohn, Sarah Nix, Jake Flanagan, and Carrie Brody. Additional thanks to Jerry Williams, Jill Gillette, Travis Dunlap, Elizabeth Wachtel, Greta Weber, Isaac Gaines, and Kasha, Sebastian, and Lucian. I'm Jake Halpern. If you enjoyed this season and are in search of more investigations like ours, well, I've got a few recommendations for you. Don't forget your Pushkin Plus membership grants you access to exclusive ad-free binges of shows like Lost Hills Dark Canyon, which investigates the dark side of Malibu, California. In Season 4, host Dana Goodyear investigates the death of a 24-year-old black woman who went missing in 2009 after being detained and released from the Malibu Lost Hills Sheriff's Station. New episodes launch June 12th. Another recommendation I have for you is Where's Dia, coming July 9th. In the beautiful mountain town of Idlewild, a millionaire widow who was in the middle of a messy legal battle with her estranged children suddenly vanishes, leaving behind her beloved horse and idyllic ranch. A man who claims to be her fiancé launches a very public campaign to find her. But when another woman dies at the same ranch, it appears that there's more to the story than meets the eye. Where's Dia begins on July 9th. And if you want to listen to something right now, I recommend you check out Death of an Artist, Krasner and Pollock. You've probably heard of Jackson Pollock, but you may never heard of Lee Krasner, an artist, Pollock's wife, and the woman who made him famous, and in so doing changed everything about the landscape of modern art. This is a story of love, power, alcoholism, brutality, and ill-timed death. You can listen to Death of an Artist, Krasner and Pollock wherever you get your podcasts. And to binge the entirety of these shows on launch day, early and ad-free, you can subscribe to Pushkin Plus on their Apple Podcast show page or at pushkin.fm/plus.